Hey, welcome back, guys, or people, however we should say it nowadays. The topic we're going to talk a little bit about now, we're going to take a shot at talking about compression ratio and piston displacement. Compression ratio, they're kind of similar. There'll be some similar things that we're talking about when we talk about compression ratio versus piston displacement. So I've got a couple of things up here on the board, and I think you can see those okay. But kind of over here, when we talk about compression ratio is where I've got my fuel air mixture here in the combustion chamber, pistons down here at bottom center, and then it gets, when we drive up to top center, we're talking about how much area I have left up here where I've compressed that fuel air mixture into. So that's compression ratio. Versus piston displacement, that one's important because piston displacement, that's where our piston's down here, bottom center, kind of start out the same here, and then we come up to top center, and now we're talking about mainly this area between here and here. That's we figure out the size and take a look at, because it is that amount of piston displacement that determines the cubic inch size of our engine. So engine measurements, they can be in liters, but for our aircraft engines here built in the United States, we do give those in cubic inch size designations, and that is the amount of piston displacement in a cylinder times the number of cylinders. Okay, talking a little bit about compression ratio first. In fact, for your notes, and there's some test questions, you'll want to kind of have this down. And let me aim the camera over here. And I want to get that definition of what compression ratio is. So you can jot this down, and like I said, there's some test questions on this. That is that volume at bottom dead center compared to that volume at top dead center. The key thing there too is that where I've got kind of underlined up there the word volume. In the test questions, there's some pretty good wrong answers that tend to make you want to bite on those that use some different words. I don't recall what they put in its place up here, but that's kind of the key thing I'm looking for when in the test question asks, what is compression ratio? And so the first thing I'm looking for, the volume at bottom dead center compared to volume at top dead center. So, like I said, get that down, kind of get that memorized, and back off, get the glare off of there. Okay, so first talking about compression ratio. Compression ratios are expressed in, well, for instance, like down here I've got written down what's considered to be a low compression engine, where it's typically 8.5 to 1 and below, or what's considered to be a high compression engine, is the one that has to use the 100 octane fuel. They're typically 8.6 to 1 and higher. We are limited how much compression ratio we can have in an engine, mainly due to the fuels that are available. When an engine is built, there has to be an agreement between the fuel companies and the engine manufacturer because if you have had a student in class here one time. He was really proud of himself. He's building up an engine, and he'd bring in the parts. He'd bring in his pistons, and he'd show us his pistons, and he would bring in the cylinder heads one day. He'd talk about how he had them all milled down, and he didn't listen, I guess, or wasn't really, didn't come together where it finally dawned on him that he was building up an engine that he has to go buy a racing fuel for. Because, as we talked about, if you try to put too low of an octane fuel in a higher compression ratio engine, then you're going to get off into that pre-ignition and detonation. And so so here's this big old fancy race engine, and he's going to commute in this thing. He was going to drive it to school every day once he had it done, because he was currently driving grandma's car. And so then pretty much now, if he's going to drive this car, if he could only buy the premium gasoline over here for it, he's going to have to drive it like grandma. He cannot step on that pedal, otherwise he's going to break things and get that engine off into detonation. So once again, we are limited about how much compression ratio an engine can have due to the fuels that are available. So that's the issue we're currently having in the United States. A problem with is where they're wanting the 100 low lead, because we still got lead, and lead's a bad thing these days according to the EPA. And so they've been building engines the last 20 years at a low enough compression ratio that they can run on probably like a 92 or a 94 or something like that octane. And we'll talk more about the fuels later, how that 100 octane is obtained. But so once again, we're limited on how much compression ratio due to the availability of the type of fuel. Okay, how we come up with that compression ratio is if I measure my area here at bottom center, so we talked about volume and bottom center, I've got 120 cubic inches, let's say, and then of course I squish that fuel air mixture up into here, and I'm left over with 20 cubic inches up here when the piston's at top center. I then take 20 into 20 once, take 20 into 120, and I come up with 6, so there I would have a compression ratio of 6:1. And that's how we come up with that. It's kind of interesting too, a little thing you can do, a little knowledge thing here. I can look over at that engine sitting over there, and let's say I'm out here by the wing. And remember, wings have a placard on the fuel tank. So from about out here, I first of all can tell that I've got this aircraft with a lovely Lycoming engine in it, because it's gray. And Lycoming traditionally is, for the most part, 90% of them over the years have always been painted that lovely Lycoming gray color. And then I can scan down at the wing, and I can see that, oh, this has a 100 octane a minimum required fuel. So I can impress my friends by saying, oh, looks like this has a high compression ratio Lycoming engine in the aircraft. I hope your friends impress easily. Okay, how are we doing on our time here? Oh, looking good. Okay, next thing we're going to talk about, and I think we're actually going to probably get into a part 2 video of this, but just to kind of get us started and get primed for our part 2 of this, is figuring up the piston displacement or the cubic inch size of the engine. So there's a couple of things we're going to need to know. I'm going to slide you over here for just a second. And first of all, there's you're going to need to have some given information to be figuring out the size of this engine. A guy could actually measure it, or you can look in your type certificate data sheet, a couple of different ways to do that. But, so the first one we're going to need to know is our bore. And bore, of course, is the diameter of the cylinder. And typically we're measuring down here, for instance, this example is showing us an exaggerated view of what we call a choke board or choke barreled cylinder, because it gets tighter at the top. Because this thing is on an aluminum head, and we're dealing with that coefficient of expansion, so when this thing comes up to operating temperature, I don't want to start off with a straight barrel and have it tapering outward, because that's really bad in a cylinder if your rings are sitting there. If they were to go whoop, whoop, get tight at the bottom, wide at the top, tight at the bottom, that ring would be moving in and out and wearing out the ring on the ring landing groove. So the idea is we start off with a choke barrel here, and so that when it heats up, it does straighten out, and so we have a nice ring end gap traveling up and down inside that cylinder. So we do measure our bore down here towards the bottom, within a couple inches of the bottom, and come up with that number. The number is going to be on our Lycoming engine. I'm going to give this to you and have you jot it down and kind of put it in a place somewhere. It's 5.125. It's 5 1/8 inch. So, but decimal 5.125 is the bore of our engine here. And then, of course, we're going to need to know stroke, as I just demonstrated on the board a minute ago. The stroke is that area that's displaced from bottom center up to top center. So We're going to chop this video off right here, and we'll come back with a part 2 and talk about dealing with the piston displacement.